and welcome specifically to Professor Chantal Conneller. We're absolutely delighted to welcome you this evening, Chantal. Chantal is the Professor of Early Prehistory at Newcastle University, and I have to say, is one of the leading experts on the Mesolithic period in this country. In fact, she's not long published a new book. I will just look at the title, Chantal, but I have actually bought it. So there we are.
Oh,
and so far
exciting.
I've read, yes, her new book is called The Mesolithic in Britain, Landscape and Society in Times of Change. And it's recorded as probably the most significant overview of the Mesolithic in Britain in a generation or so. And I think what you're going to do this evening, Chantal, is to shine a light on the Mesolithic period and break it down from a sort of monolithic. Can I hear somebody speaking? Can somebody mute themselves if they are speaking, please? Yes, to actually reveal to us, in fact, that the Mesolithic was not a uniform situation from beginning to end, but that in fact it evolved and it had many different phases to it, is the message that I think we're going to get. We're delighted that you're here, Chantal. Thank you very much. And when you're ready to start, please go ahead. And I should mention, people who've been listening to a lot of these lectures will know the score, in that if you have questions during the lectures, please type them into the chat box. And at the end of Chantal's talk, I will relay those questions to her. Okay, so over to you, Chantal, if that's okay.
Great. Well, thanks very much for inviting me. I'll just get the PowerPoint up. Always is a bit, takes its time. Great, got that there. Okay, yeah, thanks very much for inviting me. So yes, I'd like to, in this next hour, try to sell you the fact that the Mesolithic is a dynamic and exciting period. That's not always the sense one gets when one's reading about the Mesolithic, and particularly really the history of Mesolithic studies. The Mesolithic's very much been seen as a sort of correlation of adjacent periods, the Upper Paleolithic with its fancy cave art, the Neolithic with their impressive monuments. And in fact, really from when the name was first coined about 100 years ago, it was very much seen by people like Child as a sort of period of degeneration, where people became a bit lazy, sitting about in the post-glacial forests, but also sort of perhaps a time of poverty. The big herds of the Upper Paleolithic had moved on. People were scratching a living from different types of landscapes. I think one of the reasons why the Mesolithic has been seen as not very interesting is it's been seen as pretty sort of monolithic. There are many challenges to sort of try and unpick the period a bit and get a bit more of a sense of temporal change and dynamism. And this is what I'm going to try and really do in this lecture. Broadly, the Mesolithic is defined by the start of post-glacial warming and ending with the appearance of various elements of the Neolithic package. So in Britain, for about, well, looking at the radiocarbon dates, we can see that actually Mesolithic cultural signatures start around 9,400 BC, so a few hundred years after the start of warming, and ends around 9,300 BC. Traditionally, the period's been divided into two, the early Mesolithic and the late Mesolithic. This is on the basis of microlithotypes, which I'll go into a bit more in a bit. But these sort of two entities have very much taken on a life themselves, with an early Mesolithic seen as sort of terrestrial adaptations to large ungulates, and a late Mesolithic based on marine resources. These are the stereotypes. Within this, there's been very little understanding of dynamism and change. So it ends up being everything stays the same, an endless repeating seasonal round of hunting red deer or catching seals, for example. So this is how things have been for a very long time, really. But in recent decades, a really large number of Mesolithic age radiocarbon dates have been generated. And this talk's really going to be looking at what we can do with these. I think this is particularly relevant given there's been quite good projects both looking at the Upper Paleolithic, the work of Ahob, and the early Neolithic, particularly work of Alex Bayliss. Particularly work of Alex Bayliss and Alistair Whittle. And these have very much generated a sense of dynamism of these adjacent periods, and particularly in terms of the Neolithic, the fact the Mesolithic has been seen as relatively unchanging really enhances the contrast between the two. So I was really concerned to sort of try and rectify this balance and see what can be done through looking at the sort of big corpus of radiocarbon dates that have been generated over the past few decades. However, this can never be sort of the whole story, really. We can't sort of change our picture of the Mesolithic just because of the nature of the radiocarbon record. And if we look at what we have in terms of radiocarbon dated Mesolithic age sites from Cornwall, we can get a bit more of a sense of this. So first of all, according to my calculations, other people may different. There's around 15 radiocarbon dates for the county coming from 5 sites. This is not much over this long period that the Mesolithic lasts. And 10 of these are from Windmill Farm, the Lizard. These are probably reasonable dates. Others have a few question marks over them. Some may be accurate, some not. So the ones from Poldorian are bulks radiocarbon dates taken a long time ago on a site that's got late Mesolithic and early Mesolithic and early Neolithic material. So they could be giving us an entirely wrong picture of in terms of their results. We have dates from pits at Pennon's Farm and Prees Cross. These are sort of quite small areas of excavation. We don't know what sort of cultural material is with them. It's certainly not beyond the grounds possibility they might be residual. So they may be telling us exciting things about Mesolithic activities in the landscape, but they may not. Again, a similar one from Red Hill Marsh, dating a sort of enigmatic layer of wood and bark. This may tell us about a Mesolithic occupation of a lake edge, but there's no associated material. So it's something that looks a bit odd and has been dated, but we can't really go beyond that. And that's because the vast majority of sites don't have dated material. They're found as surface scatters. And indeed, even if in areas of excavation, there's quite big areas of the country where we don't get good organic preservation. And as I've discovered from looking at the radiocarbon dates, certain Mesolithic practices are much more likely to generate radiocarbon dates. So people burning hazelnuts in pits, that's a practice that is associated with a particular time period of the Mesolithic. So that's easy to date. Other periods aren't, such as the early Mesolithic, which has sort of flat hearths, not built hearths, very few pits, doesn't really preserve organic material to date. So we need a bit more of a combined approach rather than just looking at the radiocarbon record, which is very, very partial. So this brings us to this project I'm going to be talking about, which was very nicely funded by the British Academy. And that's really an attempt to sort of merge some of the older sort of typological understandings of the Mesolithic with these new radiocarbon dates to create a much more detailed sequence in which one can fit these sites that don't have dates, and thus sort of incorporate the much greater range of Mesolithic evidence, including areas of the country where we have very few dates indeed. I'd just like to say, rather than seeing typologies that indicating various cultural groups marching across the landscape, I'd see these much more as sort of as heuristics for investigating temporal change. I think change in typologies have a variety of different causes and interpretations. But the overall aim is to really move beyond this sort of monolithic or dualistic idea of the Mesolithic to really get a bit more of a sense of a dynamism, a sense of sort of historical change, what's going on in different areas at particular times. I'd just very briefly like to go into our current and our previous understandings of the Mesolithic. This sort of twofold idea of an early and late Mesolithic really comes in quite early in the 20s, not long after the Mesolithic really comes into currency to talk about particular types of archaeology. So Francis Buckley, in his work in the Pennines, noted different forms of microliths, the sort of type fossil of the Mesolithic. These little things on the top right, he noticed there were sort of larger versions and smaller versions as well. There was a bit of to and fro, which was earlier and later, but generally by 1930, there was a sense that it was an earlier Mesolithic with large microliths and a late Mesolithic with small microliths. Because most of the Mesolithic record consists of lithic scatters, people try to fill in the gaps with a few key sites that sort of paint a bit of a richer picture of the Mesolithic. So the early Mesolithic site of Star-Car, with its beautifully preserved organic remains and its early Mesolithic microliths, come to stand for sort of the ways of life that people were pursuing in the first half of the Mesolithic, and that sort of inland areas focused on a lake. We see watercourses in other parts of the country, but very much sort of focused on large terrestrial ungulates such as a red deer. The late Mesolithic has come to be much more associated with marine adaptations. This is slightly echoing patterns in Scandinavia, but the candidates were really the Orensay middens excavated by Paul Mellors in the 1970s, and these sort of again quite important sites, but with very specific types of archaeology. So marine focus, large middens, focused on particular set of marine resources. These came to stand for what was going on in the late Mesolithic. This is obviously not the case. These are just two specific sites, and of quite interesting, very specific sort of ways of life. The more one looks into other sites of the period, these are actually quite particular and unique in their particular temporal sequence. But it sort of gets stuck at this. So part of the reason is Graham Clark, who was very interested in sort of time and sequence in his early work. Clark was really the first person to sort of make really work on extensively on the Mesolithic. So at the start, the Mesolithic was very much set up on his terms in the way he sort of published what he borrowed from Buckley, what was his own ideas. So initially he was interested in working in the Cambridgeshire Fens, looking for Mesolithic and other prehistoric sites in order to use the deep stratigraphy of the fen to fit these things into sequence. He wanted to know about how they related to each other in time. So he's undertaken this work in the sort of mainly in the 1930s. But when he just a sort of decade later, he comes to excavate at Star-Car, and here he becomes much less interested in sort of time and sequence and things like that, seemingly because he is interested in sequence in terms of typology, comes to Star-Car, he gets the opportunity to have a much more rounded picture of people's lives, because we've got all this, it's got lots of organic artifacts, lots of animal bones, and that's what really attracted him. He noted at Star-Car there were sort of two, potentially two layers, but he saw these as pretty similar. He didn't really care in the differences about them, and that's very much sort of followed in some of his students and other Cambridge academics students. This idea that we have fairly similar types of evidence, and so we don't really need to delve into these minor stratigraphic and typological issues in too much depth. These are things for the past. I think it's very strange that sort of sense of time is lost at Star-Car, having worked there myself. I mean, it's a very sort of temporal, a very obviously temporal landscape. We have, again, like the fens, we have these deepish peaked sequences where you can really see sort of change in vegetation and activities over time. So this is one of our trenches at Star-Car, which the deeper area is actually one of Clark's. So this is sort of archaeology and sequences he was encountering. And we can move back through time from an area when Star-Car was on the edge of the lake, but the lake got colonized by peat, fen car. Here we can see fallen trees when the area is a fen car. If we move down, we can see the roots of these trees. If we move down to the sequence, we can start seeing the appearance of reeds from the lake edge. And then we begin to see reeds and wood. And finally, we have a mass of wood sort of washed up at the edge of the lake, and amongst it, a humanly built timber platform. And throughout this sequence, there's which lasts nearly 1,000 years, we see artifacts within it. We have wooden stake, flint tools, bits of antler. Within this sequence, it's very sort of temporal, but this is something that Clark very ignored. And with the peak, we can sort of see moments of history. We can see someone sharpening an axe in the middle picture. We can see a bag that's full of flint that's been dropped in the waters of the lake. We can see the deposition of an elk skull in the waters of the lake. So we can see these moments. But this again is something that's quite unique to Star-Car. This is not what Mesolithic archaeology really is. This is, if we focus on this sort of exceptional preservation, we're not going to understand the vast majority of the Mesolithic in Britain. So we as well as these moments we have through Alex Baylis's Bayesian modelling, we can sort of look at sort of medium-term processes. So depositional areas. This is an area of animal bone and wood and flint tools and organic tools that was deposited over a very short time, possibly even within a year or two, according to Alex. But the vast majority we get is this really dense scatter of lithics on the dryland. Get a bit of organic preservation, but it's some fragmentary bits of bone. It's not datable. It's not well enough preserved. Early Mesolithic halves were placed on the surface. They don't really leave charcoal behind. We've got some structures and some post holes that have captured a bit of charcoal, and we can get some radiocarbon dates from these, but it's not the same. We can't get the same chronology as we got from the areas of the wetlands. Of the 233 radiocarbon dates, which is nearly about a sixth of all radiocarbon dates from Britain, only 16 of these come from the dry land. So really understanding the sort of bread and butter of Mesolithic archaeology, that is sort of lithic scatters, and how to make sort of reasonable comparisons between them is really key to this. So things like the dryland area of Star-Car. This is down to Wiltshire, a really important Mesolithic site. It's got no radiocarbon dates, and it's a palimpsest of Mesolithic and later material. These are the sort of challenges of trying to make sense of the sort of the mainstream Mesolithic archaeology. Similarly, the extensive lithic scatters on the Cornish coast. How are we to make sense of these? These are datable. If you excavate, you might get a little bit of charcoal and pits, but generally this is not the case. So the answer really is to go back to some of these typologies, and some various authors have suggested there's a bit more to it than this broad early and late Mesolithic division. So there's basically typological differences in the early part of the Mesolithic, with different forms of microlith, either based on sort of angles or basal modification, which have been divided into these 4 types: star-car types, deep car types, Horsham types, and Honey Hill types. Fewer suggestions about the sort of subdivisions of the late Mesolithic, but Roger Jacobi suggested 4-sided microliths, microtranchets and rods are late, and recent work by Sarah Griffith does show a very late terminal few hundred years of the Mesolithic for so-called rod microlith sites. So I've tried to build on this work, and particularly some recent suggestions that some of these we can define a middle Mesolithic. So these types, Horsham and Honey Hill, were sometimes seen as early types. Recent evidence suggests they're perhaps a bit later, suggested initially by Régnier, but that seems to sort of follow with the current radiocarbon corpus. But these sites are southern and midland sites. Northern England and Scotland didn't have these types, so it was difficult. They seem to have what was traditionally defined as late Mesolithic at the same time as these potentially middle Mesolithic types. However, one of the findings of the project is we can actually define a middle Mesolithic for Northern England and Scotland, and that's based on little differences in scalene triangles, which are very common in the late Mesolithic. Some of the earlier sites have triangles that are variably lateralized. So you can see, if we look at the top narrow end, around 2/3 of these from this site, Prestatyn, have the shoulder at the left. Others have around 1/3 have the shoulder at the right. If we look at sites dating to after around 7000 BC, they're entirely left lateralized. So if we use this, we can split out another a third period of the Mesolithic that seems to work reasonably well in most regions. And I've also been doing a little bit of work following up on Roger Jacobi's suggestions. They don't work, which seem to be correct. We do seem to have a few types that date to the last millennium of the Mesolithic, though they're not present in all areas. So what I've been doing is collating all Mesolithic age radiocarbon dates in Britain and checking them for reliability, and particularly sort of good associations with Mesolithic evidence. Lots of them don't have that. I've done a bit of targeting dating of materials, both from new excavations and from archive sites, and I've tried to link some of these microlith types to good radiocarbon dated sites. There aren't that many sites where one can do this. It's still a bit of an issue, mainly because Mesolithic people reoccupied sites quite often, so it's not always easy to link microlith type with dates. And my colleague Sarah Griffith has been modelling these radiocarbon dates. We haven't quite finished the modelling, but she's done a preliminary model that I'm going to show you here. So this shows all well-dated radiocarbon, all well-dated Mesolithic sites that can be associated with particular microlith types. And here we can see quite nice pattern. Excuse the scale, which is in calibrated years before present, but generally see an early Mesolithic that starts around 9300 BC and ends around 8000 BC. A middle Mesolithic that starts around 8200 and lasts around 7000 BC. A late Mesolithic starts around 7000 BC. The late Mesolithic, it's difficult to say its end because we see very similar types carrying on towards the end of the late Mesolithic. We can see a final Mesolithic in some areas based on quite distinctive microlith types, little micro tranches, both asymmetrical and symmetrical, so-called rods, and little four-sided pieces, all seem to belong to this final millennium. So this gives us a bit more of a framework into which to place these sites that don't have radiocarbon dates, but which have microliths of certain typologies. So yeah, that's basically all the slightly technical working out. I'd like to spend really the rest of this lecture showing us what we get from these patterns. It's not always perfect. Some periods are more typologically distinctive. Some periods are typologically distinctive, but not in every single area. And I'm going to sort of talk about broader patterns across Britain, but also try to relate this to sort of the archaeology of Southwest Britain more generally, and the archaeology of Cornwall more specifically, which when I came to put this talk together is actually quite difficult, because the archaeology of Cornwall is a Mesolithic archaeology of Cornwall is specific, and doesn't always fit into my cunning overall scheme, but I'll do what I can. So the early Mesolithic, this is the sort of archaeology of the earliest pioneers, people moving back into Britain, probably after a cold snap in the early Mesolithic. We know there are Paleolithic groups right at the start of the Holocene warm period, but we see movement into Britain by people with Mesolithic toolkits, both along the coast for northern Britain and probably along the major rivers for southern Britain. And we see quite separate trajectories in northern and southern Britain at this time. There's not much evidence for occupation in the Midlands, so these seem quite distinct groups with their own cultural traditions. But even though they're pioneers, these certain landscapes, particularly lakes and meres and rivers, seem to be really important foci, and they rapidly gain meaning and long-term significance. We can see this at Starcar, for example. It's the earliest Mesolithic radiocarbon dates we get, but people come back to it again and again. So they socialise this landscape very quickly. They get their favoured places and favoured spots. Towards the end of the early Mesolithic, we see expansion into sort of broader range of landscapes, and there's some indications that sites generally become a bit larger. In terms of features, we get the occasional house structure, such as Starcar, but cut or built features are very rare. We do seem to have middens, but they're sort of piled up on land surfaces. So get middens at Starcar, which seem to be sort of dumps of flint and animal bone. And we have deposition of animal remains in wetlands close to a number of sites, such as Starcar and other sites in the Vale, as Pickering as well, and possibly in the south along the Kennet Valley. Because this lack of sort of cut features, it's quite difficult to date. It doesn't generate much charcoal. Very few areas have animal bone preserved, but it's very typological distinctive. So it's really easy to incorporate undated sites into this early pioneer group. If we look at some of the key sites in southwest Britain, we have a whole range of sites. We have sites focused on springs, such as Cheryl, and even hot springs where flint was deposited. We have burial sites and caves, which I'll go into in a bit more detail later. And we have sites associated with material exploitation. In Cornwall, we have Dosmery Pool, which is quite a varied site along a lake. And I think perhaps we have a pattern of sort of early Mesolithic sites in upland areas being quite varied. There's generally a stereotype that upland sites are hunting camps, but both Dosmery Pool and Terragarth Cottage seem quite varied. So we've got sort of larger upland sites that seem to be favoured places, but also more specialised sites as well. So Pasco, much more typical upland hunting camp on the lizard. The Middle Mesolithic sees the infilling of the landscape, so we get much more occupation in the Midlands and particular areas of Scotland. And we see the start of the appearance of strong regional trajectories with sort of quite different ways of life starting in different areas. There's really quite different modes of engagement in the landscape. It's quite a distinctive change. So in the north, we get large circular houses, lots and lots of pits focused on hazelnut processing and the disposal of hearth sweepings that they seem to waste disposal in pits. These features are a bit rare in the south, though they're still present. And we also get monumental scale features. So we get a series of various large pits in eastern Scotland, which have been either described as monuments or traps for animals. But we get a number of large pits and posts, probably pits, possibly posts in southwest England. So a number around Stonehenge, and other sites such as Boscombe Down, Thixton Down, Hambledon Hill. These are sort of big things, 2 meters across, often up to 2 meters deep. The Middle Mesolithic is relatively easy to date because it's typologically distinctive with its different forms of microliths. Slightly less so in Cornwall, unfortunately, which makes some of that evidence a bit more difficult to unpick. And generally, there's sort of fewer cut features in the south. So again, it falls into that trap of being a region where it's quite difficult and time period that's quite difficult to date. So here are a few sites. These are partly typological, partly through radiocarbon dating. So we can see typologically we get as far as Alla Farm and Cranton Cross, but we don't have these particular types in Cornwall. We get if we look broad elsewhere, so Blickmead, Boone Hill, Downton, Walcott 3 and 4, we begin to see we get sites that have very long histories, where we see the first occupation in the Middle Mesolithic, but we see people returning to these areas for millennia. And I think even though it's slightly difficult to untangle what's going on in Cornwall at the time, we probably see similar things. So I think some of the sites that have been broadly seen as late Mesolithic and even had late Mesolithic radiocarbon dates started in the Middle Mesolithic, based on hints from their typology. They're not as clear cut as other areas. So I think Poldorian probably belongs to this period. It's got microliths that are found associated with Middle Mesolithic sites elsewhere. And probably other sites such as Windmill Hill Farm, we see the start of this start of long-term occupation, long-term visit, intermittent visits starting in the Middle Mesolithic. So I think it is difficult to untangle, but I think probably we see similar patterns and processes as we see elsewhere in Britain. The late Mesolithic is probably the hardest to characterise. This is partly methodological because it's dominated by scaling triangles. We also see these types in the Middle Mesolithic and the Final Mesolithic. So it's slightly difficult to see exactly which sites fit into this period. But it's also seemingly, I think, an increase in regional diversity. We see much denser woodland, and we maybe see people being more sort of locally focused in particular favourable areas. But we definitely see concern with the past. Middle Mesolithic features on certain sites continue to be sort of reworked. Some of the pits in Aberdeenshire, for example, are redug and recut. We see continuity of occupation in many areas. We also see interesting regional peculiarities. So we see the appearance of shell and organic middens in coastal areas of northern Britain and also southwest Britain. Rivers seem important throughout, and also in southwestern Britain there's some interesting colourful pools and springs. We do get cut features, cooking pits, sort of so-called earth ovens for heating stones, and pit scoops and tree throws seem to be used for the deposition of midden material. But it's not, the middens don't seem sort of so focused on burnt material, so it's not always so easy to date. And potentially we get an interest in exotic raw materials and perhaps more organisation in axe production in southern England, but those patterns aren't that clear. If we look at in the southwest, we can see some quite interesting patterns, that real focus on springs in certain areas, Cheryl, and particularly tufa springs, Cheryl, and tufa areas such as Langley Lane, Blashenwell. We see that little middens appearing, not always on the coast, often in sort of forest clearings by not too far from the coast, such as Westward Hoe, Blashenwell as well, and we also get things at Culverwell. We get sites that are dated to this period in Cornwall, and we get again some interesting peculiarities. Some of these really nice engraved stones that have been found on a number of sites that Angie Jones has highlighted. I think we probably get sort of this continuity of patterns. So we have sites close to streams and a bit set back from the current coast, but not too far away. Both smaller and larger sites present, and larger sites seem particularly focused on streams and springs. And here we get sort of the better dated radiocarbon sites, and particularly Windmill Farm, where we have decent radiocarbon dates for Cornwall. The start of the radiocarbon sequence starts about 7000 BC, and now there's about 10 radiocarbon dates from the site, which shows intermittent occupation of a favoured place on and off for sort of 1700 years. If we move to the final Mesolithic, again in Britain, we see continuity of sites and favoured areas in many regions, and that's the case of Cornwall. But we also see sort of areas where there's quite a lot of change going on. So there's a bit of a mixed picture. So we see monumental scale shell middens on the Scottish East Coast. Middens that were excavated in the 19th century probably have a Neolithic component, but seem to have stretched several hundred metres. We also have large, though not quite so large, middens on Oronsay. In places like the Pennines, we see a real increase in radiocarbon dates in this last millennia, and also shifts over this period in raw material use, as well as new types of microliths. And across Britain, we see sort of new material culture referencing areas beyond Britain. So T-shaped antler axes are found in Scotland. These are the type fossil of the southern Scandinavian Ertebella. They're found across northern Europe. New work by Oxford North shows we've got potentially Mesolithic polished axes in Cumbria, perhaps showing connections with Ireland, where we also have polished axes during the Mesolithic. And these micro-tranche types, which are now pretty well dated to just over the final millennia of the Mesolithic, really seem to be a sort of insular rendering of continental trapezes and transverse arrowheads. So they're sort of miniaturized, but they have the same concept with them. So there's real hints that of foci beyond Britain, and perhaps quite long-standing continental connections in this millennium before the Neolithic. And again, if we look at our sites for the region, you can see, unfortunately, Cornwall again sort of escapes my typological scheme. So these very distinctive final Mesolithic types. They're a very small component of larger assemblages. They're not found on every site of this date, but thus far we don't have them in Cornwall. But we do have dates for Poldorian and Windmill Farm, really showing these long-term histories of these areas. So George Smith, in his sort of write-up of Windmill Farm, reckons it was at only 1% of the site was excavated by the Central Unit and the Cornwall Archaeological Society, and he estimates that maybe the whole spread would be about 7 million lithic artifacts. And I think this sort of real gives a sort of a sense of sort of scale and the way the landscapes are being used, potentially over very long periods, which is why it's quite difficult to sort of untangle typologically the sort of Cornish Mesolithic sequence, because there are these favoured places that are repeatedly occupied for a very long time. So real continuities of occupation in this area, which we see a bit in other areas, but I think it's perhaps more of a thing here. But it certainly features of other areas of the country that we see sort of sites crossing these period boundaries. So I think it's important that though this we can give the Mesolithic more distinctive flavours through this fourfold typological scheme of mine. It's important that things do cross this periodisation. We're not dealing with 4 distinct periods. We're dealing with processes, some of which are fairly short-lived within a period, and others which cross periods. So, as I said, many sites that were first occupied in Middle Mesolithic see long-term occupation into the Final Mesolithic. This even includes sort of recuts of features at some sites, such as Warrenfield and Mill Timber in Aberdeenshire, or in the southwest, the 6th millennium pit at Old Dartmouth Farm seems to be recut in the 5th millennium. So we see continuities and disjunctions of across the period, and also see this if we look at human remains. And I'd just really like to finish by showing how some of these changes can be highlighted through this scheme, just through this case study of how treatment of the dead takes place over this long period. So if we look at the early Mesolithic, we can see quite a few sites with human remains dating to this early period. So even this is quite a short period, we get a lot of sites. And there's quite a lot of variability within it. You'll see a lot of sites are caves, but not entirely. We also have a human femur associated perhaps with a tufa spring at Thatcham. We have open air burial sites on a little rise in a river valley at Grey Lake. Other sites are caves, but we see a lot of variation in how these caves are used. We have the cave cemetery site at Athelines Hole, where at least 50 individuals were interred over a relatively short period of time. We have single inhumations such as Cheddar Man at Scoff's Cave. And we also seemingly have disarticulated human remains going into some of the caves at this time. What's interesting is these sites seem to be mainly west-facing caves, which would where the sort of evening sun would be visible. So we may see broader metaphors about regeneration and resurrection in terms of treatment of the dead. In the Middle Mesolithic, we see a much more restricted range of sites, so very much concentrated in southwest England and South Wales. Here is very much sort of focused on isolated human remains rather than complete individuals, and very much focused on either northerly facing caves or shafts and swallow holes. So I think shift in the metaphor of death sort of relating to sort of darkness. Moving on to the late Mesolithic, we begin to see shifts again in the way the sort of dead are treated. We don't see human remains in caves in southwest England, which is a real change considering those have been really there since the start of the Mesolithic. Instead, we see cave burials continuing in southern Wales. But the use of coaldy is a place for we have quite a lot of human remains in caves in Coaldy Island in the middle Mesolithic, and we see this at the start of the late Mesolithic, but this sort of comes to an end probably as Coaldy is becoming an island. We see new regions being used, so Conneller in North Wales has again isolated human remains, and in eastern England we see sort of new patterns emerging. A strong association with rivers. These are 3 sites that are all very close to rivers, but quite diverse practices. Tilbury is a burial of an intact individual, a male. Langford is a cremation, where the part of the cremated human material plus pyre material is put in a pit. And Staythorpe, number 6, is it's an isolated human remain in a river. It may be an eroded burial, or it may be people dropping human remains into rivers. There's quite varied practices going on there. If we move to the final Mesolithic, we see a total change in the pattern. There's a gap of 1,000 years at the end of the late Mesolithic before we see human remains emerging again, right at the end of the final Mesolithic, and very much confined to the island of Oronsay and associated with shell middens. And these are disarticulated remains, mainly not entirely human finger and toe bones. It's been suggested these are products of excarnation practices, with people laid out on the middens, their flesh is stripped by animals and birds, and then the main bones are put somewhere else, perhaps in the sea, and the little finger and toe bones are overlooked. That said, there does seem to be slight patterning with this material. We sometimes get we can often get the human bones associated with structures, for example. So there's quite complex things going on. But if we take this chronological approach, we can see real sort of shifts in the way people are processing their dead in different periods and different regions. So finally, where does this leave us? We've got a much better understanding of broad patterns of microearth change in some regions, and this allows us to set up this periodization, which allows much more understanding of sequence and temporal change. Some of the changes we see broadly fit this fourfold periodization. I think particularly the start of the middle Mesolithic is quite dramatic in terms of the changes we see. But other sort of practices, such as burial, disarticulated human remains in caves, continue across many of these boundaries. But I think we do get more of a sense of the Mesolithic as a dynamic period. It's not where people are just scratching a living, either from the forest or from the sea. The Mesolithic was a dynamic period. We see pits, middens, houses, monuments appearing for the first time in the archaeological record. And really the Mesolithic must be seen as sort of the first long-term occupation of particular sites of regions after a much more sort of intermittent and interrupted partial record from the Upper Paleolithic. So in the Mesolithic, people started new relationships with place. Some of these changed, and some of these had long histories of particular types of engagement with particular favoured landscapes. And that is all I have to say. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk. If anyone's got any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them.
Chantal, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. I don't know if you saw it, but there was a wonderful example of the longevity of a Mesolithic site on Digging for Britain this week. It was a site on Islay and the southern tip of the Shetlands, where they were suggesting, in fact, that they'd found evidence that it was actually continuous, well, maybe not continuously occupied, but certainly had been a chosen site from the late Paleolithic onwards, which struck me as being amazing considering how hardy the people must have had to have been at that time. I've got one question, if I may, before I look to see what other questions are in the chat box. I used to work in Sussex, and we had quite a splendid collection of Mesolithic axes. And you haven't mentioned axes, and of course axes are only useful, I suppose, if you're in a wooded area, and most of our stuff was from the Weald. But is there any help, any evidence to be had from the distribution of the Mesolithic axes?
Yeah, it's interesting. They're not very well dated Mesolithic axes, which is a bit of a problem. In the north, they're only early Mesolithic, but there's the patterns seem a lot more complex in the south. But from dated sites, my sense is that there's quite small scale production, sort of personal use in the early Mesolithic, and perhaps this shifts when we come to sort of the middle and late Mesolithic. I think some of those sort of Sussex sites where the sort of rivers cut through the chalk, there's real concentrations around there. And I think these become perhaps favoured places for sort of intensive axe production. And there's perhaps a bit more, perhaps a slightly more organised approach. There's potentially sites where it seems that they're also focusing on solution hollows for getting flint for axe production. And there's a few sort of sites in Kent where potentially we've got quite late dates for quite extensive axe production sites. So, but they're not very, again, because they're mainly sort of surface scatters with a bit of excavation, no features. It's quite difficult to sort of pin that down temporally, but there's potentially, I think, quite interesting patterns going on in some areas.